Jared, I didn't know we were both NYU guys.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, I'm a class of '96, I guess, technically. But yeah, I did a film and I worked in the film industry in New York for a long time before moving back to Florida a while ago.
Oh,
Yeah. Did you graduated from
from
was it
NYU.
Stella
I was in
Adler
their
you were
BFA program.
Yeah, yeah.
Their acting program was Stella Adler, little Stella.
Yeah. And you said there was a quote on one of episode of your podcast, something to the effect of your goal was to be we're starting this a little bit early, a great actor and a good stand-up. Do I have that in the right order?
I was a great stand-up and a solid actor. It was the added opposite. Yeah, yeah.
I think you guys are ready to get started. Are you ready?
Okay. Yeah, tell me when to stop sharing.
Kind of ready to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and just introduce everybody to our program tonight. I am Debbie Hockman. I'm the Director of Arts, Culture, and Education at the David Posnack JCC in Fort Lauderdale. And I'm welcoming you to the Florida JCC's Book and Author Series. And I've said it before, and some of you have heard it, but really this series is actually, I think, the best thing that came out of the pandemic. We were already partnering on a lot of programs, but joining 6 communities together through a love of books and reading has really been a fantastic partnership. And we look forward to these programs joining together authors and our local celebrities in conversation. So on behalf of the David Posnack JCC in Fort Lauderdale and the Alper JCC in South Miami and the Galbert Family JCC in Miami Beach and the Adolph and Rose Levis JCC in Boca Raton, the Mandel JCC in the Palm Beaches, and the Michael Ann Russell JCC in North Miami Beach, we thank you so much for being a part of this community and a part of this event. Just in case you are in the wrong place, we just want to make sure you know that tonight's program is a conversation about the book, The History of Stand-Up, and we have author Wayne Federman with us, and with him is our own Jared Blount from the David Posnack JCC. This is a Zoom, and it is best viewed if you change your setting on your own computer to speaker view, and that is in the top right-hand corner on most people's settings. So if you go ahead and do that, you'll see just the speakers. You are muted and you will stay that way. It is possible during the conversation, if there's a question and answer part, we may unmute you, but we ask you not to touch the mute button so that everybody can have a great viewing situation. And if during the program you have any questions, we're going to ask you to put those into the chat feature, and we will attempt to get to all the questions, but we ask you for your understanding if time does not allow for us to get to them. One other thing, if you haven't purchased your copy of The History of Stand-Up, we're going to encourage you to visit our partners at Books and Books, and we will put the link in the chat room for you so you can click right on that and purchase one for you, one for your family, friends, whoever you want. So we want to encourage you to do that. And thank you again for being with us, because tonight is about laughter, and laughter is contagious. And even if you're unable to alter a stressful situation, and I think in the last 22 months, everybody on this Zoom has probably experienced 1 or 2 stressful situations. The more laughter you bring into your own life, the happier you are and those around you will feel. And throughout history, stand-up comics have really strived to find humor in good times and those challenging times, and really to make us laugh. So tonight we had asked Jared Blount to be our moderator, because not only does he have the ability to find humor, and he often makes us chuckle, but he has a lifelong love of comedy and film. He earned a degree from NYU's film school, and he worked in that industry for many years before coming to South Florida. And currently, Jared is a magazine publisher. He's a photographer. He's a DPJCC board member. He's a husband and a dad. And I know he's really looking forward to talking with our guest, Wayne Federman. So Jared, would you like to introduce Wayne?
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. I want to say up front that tonight's discussion revolves around comedians and the history of comedy over more than a century. And some of the stuff that may come up may seem a little outdated or controversial by today's standards. You can't discuss history without discussing the unpleasant parts as well. We're all on board with that. Yes, good, thank you, moving on. And Wayne, you'll pardon if I haven't memorized the introduction here. I am delighted to introduce to you a fellow NYU alumnus and former South Floridian, Wayne Federman, is he a comedian? Yes. An actor? Yes. A writer, musician, podcaster, and bona fide USC professor of comedy? Yes, 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 and yes. Over the course of almost 40 years, Wayne has built a wonderfully diverse career with credits that range from being the head monologue writer on Jimmy Fallon to acting roles in Curb Your Enthusiasm, Legally Blonde, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, The Larry Sanders Show, and many others, to co-producing the fantastic and moving HBO documentary, The Zen Diaries of Gary Shandling, a must-watch if you haven't seen it already, to starting his own film festival and on, all while performing stand-up comedy, a remarkable collection of which you can hear on his career-spanning album, The Chronicles of Federman. But tonight is all about Wayne's fascinating new book, The History of Stand-Up. So let's get going. Please join me in welcoming the man whose Wikipedia entry includes the perhaps unnecessary line, Federman is Jewish. Wayne Federman. Wayne, I do wonder if the contributor of that information was claiming you or tracking you. It seems that, yeah.
I'm guessing claiming. I'm going to guess claim. But the paranoid, yeah, I love that you could think that was like, yeah. The thing with Wikipedia is you don't have no control of it. So are you saying my name is so obviously Jewish that it was redundant? What are you trying to say?
I'm saying that when you look at Bob Hope, it doesn't say Bob Hope was Presbyterian or whatever he happened to be. It just seems to be us who have their religion/ethnicity highlighted in a Wikipedia entry.
I know.
Yeah,
it's an interesting. I think it's people wanting that anyone that has any sort of credibility, they're like, oh, he's Jewish, and they glom onto it. My mom was very much like that. She knew anyone who was Jewish or half Jewish, any celebrity, she was into it.
I appreciate your optimistic outlook. But so, history of comedy. Let's start with the basics. Stand-up comedy, what's the difference between stand-up and like a humorous monologuist or somebody doing a comedic one-person show like Billy Crystal's 700 Sundays? What's unique about stand-up?
Well, the unique element of it is usually it's directed to the audience. It's almost it seems like a casual conversation with the crowd. And there was a comedian named Dana Gould, really funny dude, and he described it this way, that stand-up comedy is a conversation, but only one person is talking. And so
hopefully.
Right, exactly. I love it. So that's that's different than like a play, which is a very specific. This is a play. I do this play no matter what. These are the lines. Where stand-up tends to have a little more malleable, if that's a word, if that's even a word.
One of those was a word. I think the last one. The term stand-up itself has mob origins, maybe. What's the story there?
Well, this is the thing. There's a little bit of debate among us stand-up nerd historians. It happens in the late 1940s, and there's many eras of stand-up, just to kind of broaden this out a little bit. And one of them was the nightclub era. There might be a few people here who were around when that was the predominant place where a lot of stand-ups worked. So, and they had these very exotic names like the Copacabana and Ciro's and the Latin Quarter and Macambo and all of this. And they were all run by the mob. They were all run by the mafia. And the mafia also handled boxers. And a stand-up boxer was a boxer that would stand in the ring and just take punch after punch, not run around. And they thought that was what these comics were doing starting in the 40s. Were just kind of just standing there on stage. I'm sure you've seen pictures of them with that microphone, just like, oh, we're going at it. And so that's one theory. The other theory is that it was shorthand for a specific kind of comedy act. So like if you were a booker in the Catskills and you were like, you wanted an adagio dance team, maybe you wanted a juggler and a singer, and a stand-up meant the guy didn't need any music. He just did jokes. There was no charts. There was nothing else involved with the act other than that person. Whereas opposed to like a comedy team might need, the drummer to do rim shots or something like that. So does that help? Are we done? Is this thing over? Are we finished?
We can move on to the next
Okay.
question. We got
No, I meant is the whole thing over.
Half an hour to go. Here.
Oh, we have more time. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay. Yes. The history, and we don't nearly have enough time to encompass everything that's in the book, but we'll do what we can. Your book begins with a discussion of the what you call the four forefathers of American stand-up: Mark Twain, Will Rogers. Hopefully, everybody's heard of the two of them. Burt Williams. But there was one guy who was a surprise even to you. What can you tell us about Artemus Ward?
Well, Artemus Ward is the first of them, of these four forefathers. He was a newspaper guy in Cleveland, Ohio, writing for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Still exists today, that paper. And he would write these funny kind of letters with misspelled words. And he printed them in the paper, and they got syndicated all over the country. And he became really famous as this guy, Artemus Ward, very much like Samuel Clemens became Mark Twain. Artemis's real name is Charles Brown, believe it or not. So anyway, so he's doing this, he's making like $12 a week at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And one of his jobs is to cover the local entertainment scene. And who comes traipsing into Cleveland is the minstrel show, which was all the rage. We're talking about 1858 right now. A couple years before Lincoln and the Civil War and all of that. And so one of the without going deep into what minstrel shows are, but there was two end men that would do like kind of corny jokes. And one of them starts doing Artemus Ward bits out of the newspaper that he had read. And Artemus was like, oh, great. They're already stealing my material and doing it on stage. This is a classic story that's happened a lot. So he has an epiphany and decides to perform his own material on stage, and he does it across the United States. And in a very interesting way, there was something called the Lyceum movement. I hate to use the word movement, but that's what it's called. And that was like speakers would go from town to town talking about botany or the Revolutionary War or Greek mythology, just like TED Talks, basically. So people paid money because we had like already in the 1850s, like there was a kind of a burgeoning middle class happening in the United States. We're starting to kick it a little bit. So that's where Artemus Ward took his stand-up act, and it wasn't called stand-up then. Again, as we already learned from 4 minutes ago, stand-up started in the term stand-up started in the late 40s, but he started performing this thing called Babes in the Wood. And his whole angle was he would never talk about Babes in the Wood. Like that was his whole, and he did an hour and 20 minutes and people loved it. And he got so famous. Jerry got so famous toward the whole country. He was in Lewiston, Maine. He's in San Francisco. His legend goes, he publishes a book of his old articles. Lincoln loves it. He quotes him. He goes overseas to England, sells out over there, and then very much on brand for anyone born in the 1800s, dies of tuberculosis at age 32. So he's done at the peak of his thing. But before he dies, he meets Sam Clemens, and Sam Clemens always said that Artemus Ward was the funniest man he ever saw. And then when Twain decided to tour a few years later, he used that style that Artemus Ward had taught him. Is that too long and boring?
That's amazing. So, no, that was exactly what I wanted to hear. It actually, I'm going to jump ahead 100 plus years or so. Because,
let's do it.
This happens a lot. What happens a lot, and this is a bit of a side thing, people are so well known in their time, and then just a couple of decades later, they're almost forgotten. In my lifetime, I think of somebody like David Brenner, who could not have been bigger in the 70s and 80s, but now even comedians don't seem to talk about so much. Why do you think it is some people are remembered and some are sort of forgotten? What about a particular performer gives them a lasting influence?
Usually the comedians that are remembered are someone, unfortunately, who did something outside of stand-up. So like Seinfeld had that television series, people are going to know him. Bob Hope had all of those movies with Bing Crosby and his own, My Favorite Brunette and all of that stuff. So if Bob Hope only had his radio show, like let's say Fred Allen And some of you may have heard of Fred Allen. I love him, but he's basically kind of forgotten compared to like Jack Benny, who had a big television show also and had these big television specials. So that's my take on it. What do you think? Does that sound right to you, Jared?
I mean, it sounds fair enough. I guess it's also a question of, to me, I mean, being outside the profession, how much of an influence did a particular comedian have on other comedians? And we'll talk about Richard Pryor later, but Richard Pryor will never be forgotten because almost every comedian I hear says that he was the greatest comedian of all time. Again, I won't talk about that later. So how much do people carry on the legacy of a particular person?
A little bit. I mean, there's a few that are just so monumental that they do have this shadow effect where they're like everyone's kind of performing in their shadow. But even Will Rogers, who was huge. I mean, people can maybe know Will Rogers' Follies or something like that, but don't know that he toured the whole world. And you know, and when he died, he was so popular. You're talking about David Brenner. Will Rogers was so popular when he dies in 1935 in a horrible plane accident that just shocks the nation. Because at that point, we're like, oh, is there going to be commercial air travel? And then all of a sudden, like this famous guy goes down, and that all the federal buildings, flags at half staff, the flags. The day of his funeral, 2 minutes of silence on all the radio networks, Mutual, NBC, CBS, NBC Red and Blue, and also movies stopped projecting in the middle of the movies for 2 minutes. It was a shock to the system of the United States. So I know you're talking about David Brenner because you knew him when you were a kid or something.
My lifetime.
Will Rogers was so cute and now not forgotten, but I feel like, I don't know, like there's not a Will Rogers award, but there's a Mark Twain prize every week. So I'd be curious what people has anyone, no one's put in a question in the chat.
Yeah, this is actually a good time for my people that best.
Look at this. We have 160 people. I see some people.
163 people.
Beverly, I see you. I'm looking at you right now. I know it's happening. This is good. I wish I was there. I swear I wish I was there, but we're going to try to make the best of it. What's next, Jared? Oh, another Beverly
you mentioned
Rose.
Bob Hope, so let's talk about Bob Hope for a sec.
Yeah, let's do it.
He used to talk about how when in his early days, he would perform, I believe the term is in one. What does in one mean?
Great question, Jared. Thank you for reading the book. In one meant it was a term that came out of vaudeville. And if you think of a vaudeville theater with a curtain in front and then a second curtain and a third curtain, it meant you performed in the front lip of the stage in front of the very curtain, the number one curtain right at the front. And so these acts were valuable because you perform in one, it was called, in that little area, that little 6 feet lip of the stage between the front curtain and the audience. And that meant that they could set up like plate spinners or elephants or, clear the floor for the dancers, or maybe there was a sketch, or maybe Ethel Barrymore was going to do an acting scene. Vaudeville was a series of unrelated acts. So these monologists, a lot of them would perform in one. And I just kept using the term. I just felt like it was a great poetic way of describing really the loneliness, the absolutely one person in the arena standing there trying to get laughs. I don't know if you know this, Jared, but apparently human beings' biggest fear is speaking in front of an audience, like more than death for a lot of people. Yeah. And so if you take that and then add the expectation of trying to get laughter, just the pressure that us comedians are under is immense. And when it works, it's phenomenal. And when it doesn't, I'm not speaking from experience, but I've heard when it doesn't work, it's brutal for everyone, not just the comedian, the audience too. It's terrible for those people. So again,
we're going to jump around here. Dave Chappelle said that when he was early in his career, and he went on stage at the Apollo, which is a famous, black theater in New York City. And he went on Amateur Night at the Apollo, and he bombed. Bombing actually made him feel more confident about his act. Do you know the story there?
Yeah, that's it. That's why Dave Chappelle is cut from a different cloth. He's on the cover of my book. And like for most people, when they bomb, it's a really traumatic experience because it's not like, they didn't like this song or they didn't like this arrangement or that play was garbage. It was like, no, we don't like you. Guess what, comedian? We don't like you. And they booed Chappelle off the stage of the Apollo Theater. And Chappelle, instead of, like most neurotic people, and I'm talking about Jewish people, most of us would internalize that rejection and make it traumatizing. He was like, oh, guess what? I'm hanging out with my mom. I'm hanging out with my friends after this. This is all, that's the worst thing that can happen. I'm going to be fine. And he said from that moment on, he was bulletproof as far as rejection from a crowd. How about that, Jared? How about that for an enlightened way to turn around a negative?
Well, you've been through the worst, so nothing bad can happen to you at that point. We do have a couple of questions. Jane and Bev, I see your questions. I think they're good questions. I'm going to save them for the end as we're on a roll in a certain history thing right now, but we'll talk about, we'll get Wayne's opinion on his favorite stand-ups.
I love it. Okay.
We're not going to forget about you. Bob Hope, going back for a second here, he was...
Now, Jared, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Are you hearing me okay?
I hear you perfectly. Should I speak louder?
All right. Well, there's something
okay.
going on. All right. We'll figure it out.
All right. So you just let me know. Go like this if there's an issue. So there's a long tradition. Bob Hope is probably the most famous example of comedians going overseas to perform for combat troops, right? He was very well known for that, but he wasn't the first person to do that. The first person was actually a woman.
Correct.
Yes,
Her name is...
Who was that?
Oh, she's an incredible vaudeville performer. Also did acting. Her name was Elsie Janis, long forgotten. I'd be surprised if anyone's heard of her in this group. But she was famous for impressions, even when as a kid, and not just of women. It was the big acts at that time, like Faye Templeton and stuff like that. And she could, Sandra Bernhard, she could do them, but she could also do George M. Cohan and Will Rogers and the guys and stuff. And she did Fanny Bryce as well. So when the boys went over in 1917, the end of 1917, she went over there and performed on the back of pickup trucks. And, this is World War I. This is a tough gas war. This is, and she would do shows and she would do sing-alongs and she'd do her impressions. And she was the first performer this is 20 years before there was a USO. The USO didn't even exist. And then if you read her book, man, Jared, is so brutal. She would talk about visiting those hospitals and performing for those guys who are just in the worst. If you can imagine what the medical treatment was in 1917 and 18 over in France. So she's a real trailblazer. And I loved that I talked about her in my book and gave her some credit. She was known as the sweetheart of the AEF, the American Expeditionary Forces. So I know a lot of people are into the AEF. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, you bring up, I want to give some advice to people who, after tonight, are going to buy your book, because I know everybody is. What's one of the great things about your book as a resource is that I strongly recommend that people, he has Wayne and his partner. Who's your partner on the podcast? What's the gentleman's name?
Oh, Andrew Stevens. Yeah.
Yes, they have a podcast by the same name, History Stand Up. And I recommend listening to the podcast while you're reading the corresponding chapter in the book, because they complement each other. Because what you'll get from the podcast is material. You'll actually get to hear some of the people who are being discussed in the book, which I think is very helpful. But it's also, thanks to YouTube, it's a great launching point to, when we mentioned, some of the names that are being brought up tonight. Anybody who's existed since recording technology existed can be found on YouTube. People you wouldn't think of, people who recorded in 1880, you can find them on YouTube. So you can spend weeks going through Wayne's book, listening to the podcast, and do it. If you love comedy, like I do, like presumably everybody who does here tonight, it is a great launching point to discover a whole world you didn't know existed.
Thanks,
So
Jared. For most,
yes.
can I just say, I'm not
Yeah.
really recommending the 2-week deep dive. You can just, the book you can read maybe in a night. It's 145 pages. I don't.
Well, they don't have to be
Suddenly
14
it's,
consecutive days. Yes.
You're lost. Where are they? I don't know. They're reading. They're listening to Henny Youngman bits from 1936. You don't have to do that.
Wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't shame the Henny Youngman fans. Yes. Who recorded the first stand-up comedy album?
Well, it's controversial. The first live, from my understanding, the first live stand-up comedy album, there were comedy albums of Bob Hope's radio show that were put out. So, but that wasn't specifically a comedy album. Was Red Fox in 1956. And then, but there was a recording, this is so nerdy, of Mort Saul that he did in 1955 that later got released. So a lot of people think that's the first one. But there was probably someone before then. But the first big ones were Mort Saul, and then a guy from Chicago named Shelley Berman, who did his album called Inside Shelley Berman. And the first gold album, first stand-up to win a Grammy Award. But then, right after that, this kid from Chicago, Bob Newhart, records The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart, becomes the #1 album in the country for 14 weeks, and on the Grammy Awards, wins Best New Artist Comedy Album, obviously, but also wins Album of the Year, beating out Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and those other singers. So just try to imagine going to the Grammy Awards, and instead of Beyonce or Kendrick Lamar winning a Grammy, it's like, oh, Jim Gaffigan just won the Album of the Year. It would be insane. That's how big that comedy album craze was. And I'd love to know if anyone was here, alive in the late 50s, early 60s when that happened, when those albums started dropping, and then everyone started doing comedy albums, except some of the older comedians were against it, Jared. Like Alan King. Yeah, Alan King said, why should I put my act out for $1.98 or $2 when I'm making 18 grand a week in Vegas? Really interesting, like kind of a divide.
It's called, yes. Yeah, he wasn't taking into account, $1.95 times 100,000 or whatever it may be.
Or just the reach of it, like how many people would become fans of this. Yeah.
One of the most interesting things about that particular Bob Newhart album is that was a recording of the first time he ever performed on stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not the first time he ever, his first nightclub booking is the way it is, actually what it is. Yes. Yeah. His first nightclub booking, because he was just kind of did these little radio things with his buddy, and then Warner Brothers, they had seen what happened with Shelley Berman. And they were like, Warner Brothers was a relatively new label at that time. And they're like, let's do another comedy album, because they're cheap to make. And they decided to do Bob Newhart. And Bob Newhart was like, I'd love to do it. I don't have any bookings here in Chicago. No one will book me in Chicago. Guess where they sent him? Down to Houston, Texas, at the Tidewater, or the Tidelands Motel and Club. And he was the opening act. He wasn't even the headliner.
The comedy mecca of Houston, Texas.
Of course, Tidelands.
Let's go to a question here. Barbara Zion asks.
Yes, Barbara.
About Mae West. What about Mae West?
Well, it's a great question, because a lot of people want to know, like, when did women get into stand-up? And the first two were specifically stand-up, were Moms Mabley and a woman named Jean Carroll. I'll get to them in a minute. But before then, there was a number of funny women. Most of them did music as well. We were just talking about Elsie Janis. She's one of them. Obviously, Sophie Tucker was another one. Mae West, she didn't really she did an act, but she more did plays, was her thing. She would write these very funny, provocative plays and play these characters. But she was part of that wave of, like, they didn't want just a woman standing on stage doing jokes back then. Here's what's interesting about Mae West, because we all know Lenny Bruce got arrested, right? In the 61, for the language. Mae West not only got arrested, went to jail for 8 days in 1927. Jail for speaking obscenities on stage. She wasn't even using dirty words, but she was using a lot of double entendre. So maybe later at the end of this, we can talk about cancel culture, but that's the government saying, we don't want that on our stages, and you're going to be in jail for that. Crazy, right? Great question, by the way.
Somebody has to break the new ground. Someone has to take those first steps and push the boundaries so that those who come afterwards have an easier time. And those who are willing to do it, they pay the price sometimes. But history remembers Mae West. History remembers Lenny Bruce, who's a character now on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So it is, their efforts were well worth it. Somebody was asking if we're going to see any video clips. I don't think we have any video clips. I know we have. I don't know if you have anything you want to share with us in terms of your.
Let me see.
USC
Yeah, let me
material.
try to. I'll share something. I'll share a little thing. We don't have any. Give me 1 second. This is terrible. Okay, I got it.
Should I sing the Jeopardy music?
I got it.
Okay, all right.
Can you see that?
Not as of yet.
Okay, it's not working. Sorry.
What do you describe the pictures for us? There we go. Yeah.
There we go. So we were talking about Joan Rivers. We'll go through that. These are all the early ones. We talked about vaudeville performing in one. Here's something I wanted to talk about. That very early on, there was a lot of ethnic comedians. If you can see here, there's a Scottish guy, an Irish guy, obviously the African-American and blackface, and the Jewish comedian. That was a big part of vaudeville. And that all changed. By the way, if you think this is offensive, it does look offensive, but think about this group. The Marx Brothers. Most people remember them. If you really break down, Groucho was doing a German character. Obviously, Harpo, because it's in black and white, you don't know. That's a Irish character he was doing. He's not speaking, but that was Patsy Brannigan was the name of that character. And of course, full-on Italian was Chico. So even the Marx Brothers were based in ethnic comedy. And the first big selling comedy record was this guy, Joe Heyman, who did Cohen on the Telephone. I don't know if you can see it, Hebrew Humor. But anyway, that was a record about a guy making a phone call. And then we have these early stand-ups. And then it changes with this guy. This guy is like, I'm not going to dress as, I'm Irish. This is Frank Fay, by the way. I'm Irish. But I'm not going to dress as an Irish guy. I'm just going to dress as a sharp guy from Manhattan and MC. And suddenly there was a number of comedians that were performing in this style, not in funny outfits, not as ethnic stereotypes, not with blackface, none of that. And he influenced three young comedians with this style. That was, of course, Bob Hope and Jack Benny and Milton Berle. And so I'm going to stop the share because that's a kind of a fun little thing we did.
That is a rather unusual. This is an interesting pose for a publicity still for
he's holding his. I don't know what he's doing.
I don't quite know.
That was Berle with the old nose too. That was Berle.
They caught him.
And also, I know we're talking about Judaism a little here because this is the six JCCs converging for this event. Was that a lot of the goal of these comedians, and there was a lot of Jewish comedians, obviously, was assimilation. That was the goal. So Benjamin Kablowski becomes Jack Benny. Mendel Berlinger becomes Milton Berle. Jerome Levitch becomes Jerry Lewis. Leonard Schneider becomes Lenny Bruce. It goes on and on with Red Buttons and everything like that.
Melvin Kaminsky, is that Mel Brooks?
Exactly, Mel Brooks.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not. So I just want you to think of that like somebody like Jerry Seinfeld was like, yeah, I'm fine with Seinfeld. I can deal with it. Like I don't know if it says
Federman.
he's Jewish on his Wikipedia page, but I assume it does.
I think it probably. They're keeping careful track. Since you brought it up, it was actually on my list of questions. 20th century humor in America, in particular, heavily influenced by the Jewish perspective. Like even if the people are hiding behind less Jewish sounding names, or perhaps writing material for non-Jewish performers, but the Jewish influence on 20th century humor in this country is on one track of humor. And I want to talk about the other track of humor when I talk about the Chitlin circuit and everything in a moment. But on one track of humor, unbelievable, like an oversized influence compared to the population in the country. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, it was written about quite extensively, and there's a number of theories. I would love to know what you people there at the JCCs of Miami Beach, North Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, Miami. I know there's another one I'm forgetting. But here's my thought on it was, one, it was, Judaism is based on, whatever, the Torah. It's not only the Torah. It's not just you have to know the Torah. There's also the Talmud, which is a bunch of other people going, oh, I have another opinion. And then people have another opinion on that. So it's a very verbal kind of, let's break down this, let's break down the breakdown kind of religion. So that's part of it. And obviously education, it's a big, it's emphasized in Judaism. And also a lot of these people are first or second generation immigrants. And we're like, oh, wow, this is better than hiding from Cossacks. I get to do my little comedy act on stage. And they were like very successful at it very early. And it's not just comedy. Also, if you look at the history of musical theater, there's so many credible composers, Hammerstein and all of these guys, obviously. So, and Irish and African American, but that's my take, that it was like a good fit, and that Jewish people are like, okay, I may have to cut off my nose and take the berg out of my name, but I can really do this. I'd love other people's thoughts on that.
George Feld comments, Jews were not allowed to work for many industries, so they went to the arts where they could work. And Barry Shapiro, yes, Barry, I had a similar thought. He says much of humor comes from pain, hence Jewish and Black comedy. And you know what? And that's a good intro. Let's talk. What are chitlins? What's the chitlin circuit? What's Toba? Fill us in, Wayne.
Well, unfortunately, before 1960, show business was very much segregated, especially live performance. Then that includes the Catskill Mountains, the pride and joy of the Jewish comedy lineage. And so there were a few comedians that Burt Williams is one of the most famous, who got to play mainstream vaudeville. But for the most part, African Americans were siloed into a Black vaudeville circuit called Theater Owners Bookers Association, called TOBA. That became the Chitlin circuit when vaudeville dies around 1930. And the Chitlin circuit was little clubs, big theaters. You might play the Earl in Philadelphia. You might play the Howard in Washington, D.C. You might play the Apollo in New York City starting in the 30s. But you also might play these little gin joints and all across the country where people would do comedy. So that's where you had a lot of like Step and Fetch It, and Mom's Mabley came, and Willie Howard. And there was a number of these, Willie Best. And so unfortunately, they were like siloed until 1960, when this very important comedian who's in my book, named Dick Gregory, out of Chicago, goes and headlines the Playboy Club because, believe it or not, it's not in the book, but I'll tell you this, because there was a comic named Irwin Corey, Professor Irwin Corey, I don't know if you remember him, but he was like the world's foremost expert, and he would kind of double talk his way through stuff. Really care. He didn't want to work on a Sunday night. So I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Hugh Hefner. It's like, let's try the local kid from
that guy. Yeah, Hugh Hefner. Yeah.
from Dick Gregory.
Yeah.
And it went great. It became a local news story. It got picked up by the national news. It became huge, so big that Jack Parr, who was hosting the Tonight Show, hopefully some people remember Parr used to host that show after Steve Allen, before Johnny. And he was like, I got to get this guy. I'm reading about him in Esquire magazine. I'm reading about him in Time magazine. And Dick Gregory, we're running out of time. Dick Gregory, very interested, says, look, I'll go on your show, but I have to, after I do my stand-up, sit down and chat with you at the desk, because I've noticed that a lot of African-American performers, Billy Eckstein in particular, would go on, do their act, and then you'd never really hear about, like, oh, this is a real person with a family and stuff. So Dick Gregory is a very important person in the history. He's the Jackie Robinson, really, of stand-up comedy.
You know, it kills me that we're running out of time, because I have a whole list of stuff here I'd love to speak with you about, but it is what it is. We're going to skip over the influence of Johnny Carson and Ed Sullivan, and it kills me. Read the book, folks. It's in the book, and it's on the podcast. But so I want to talk about your era, because you came up starting in the early 80s. And so you saw in the 80s, comedy was everywhere. And then 10 years later, it wasn't. And so what was it like for you and for your friends, your fellow comedians, being a comedian during this boom time? And then how did you survive the bust until it all boomed again?
Well, before we went on the air, Jared, we talked about my goal. I had a very specific goal in my career, which was to be a great comedian and be a solid actor. So I was diversifying already in the late 80s. I had started doing some commercials and things like that. So I already had like a little bit of a acting career as well. So it wasn't as bad. But yeah, I don't know if you remember, but there's comedy club. There was a famous comedy club down in Fort Lauderdale called the Comic Strip. Young Eddie Murphy played there, and I played there in '84, and it was one of the first road clubs in Florida. Now there's a lot of them all over. There's an Improv, I think, in Miami, and there's one in outside by that, I don't know, the Hard Rock, by the Hard Rock, I think, has an Improv, and in West Palm they have one. So I just want to really quickly, before we get to this, say I was the beneficiary, or my generation, of the idea of the comedy club. And I know it sounds like everyone like, oh, it's not that big a deal, but it was huge, because no one had put comic after comic after comic after comic on the same show. The idea of that was so foreign to everyone. It was like, oh, in a nightclub, you might have a comic and, like I said, a singer and a thing. And then, and then, oh, Dinah Washington is headlining, or Ella Fitzgerald. So now it's comic. And the idea, people loved it all across the United States. And so there were comedy clubs in every major city, hundreds of comedy clubs, millions of dollars being spent on this new industry that started in the late 70s. And then when I joined, there was clubs all over the place. So there was a lot of work. And then there was also these TV shows like Evening at the Improv and stuff that we also performed at. And then in the late 90s, there was a big correction, because people were like, oh, I can just see these comedians at home on cable, on A&E, or on Fox's Comic Strip Live. And so there was a big retrenchment. It wasn't the end of stand-up comedy. People were wringing their hands thinking it was, but it really wasn't. It really wasn't.
Well, it was, you also expressed the opinion in the podcast, in the book, that maybe the business model of comedy clubs became unfavorable, became an expensive night out with a 2-drink minimum and a meal. And it was all of a sudden not the casual thing that it was perhaps when Bud Freeman accidentally started the Improv.
Right. Well, everyone got greedy. What can I tell you? They kept upping that cover charge and doing I remember doing 3 shows on a Saturday night. We do and 8, so it was like 90 minutes. That show was over, and then they just blare music to clear the room. And it was just not, it just seemed like a money-making machine as opposed to like, oh, this is a real artistic movement that's happening in the United States.
Okay, I'm going to put my questions aside for a sec, and let's get to some audience questions. We'll go back up to Jane Schwartz right at the
By the
beginning
way,
here.
Danny Reed, I noticed you nodding during this entire thing. I feel like you know a lot about this. It just seems like you're like, oh yeah, Wayne, I know what you're saying. Have I gotten anything wrong yet? All right, love it. Thank you.
Excellent. So Jane Schwartz asked, tell us please your opinion of 3 to 5, it's a very specific range, best stand-up acts, and why Bev Friedman had a similar question.
My best stand-up acts.
Yes, your favorite, your top 3 current stand-up acts.
Oh, current.
Current, yeah. Oh, actually, I'm interpreting it. I'm interpreting it as current. You know what?
Okay.
Let's open it. If you want to open it up, we'll say all.
No. There's a kid in New York named Sam Morrell who's just phenomenal. He's really, really incredible. And of course, I don't know. I really liked Amy Schumer, and I'm trying to think of, and obviously Mulaney and Bill Burr, and those guys are really just state of the art stand-ups that are excellent. Especially Mulaney is, I just think, excellent. And yeah, those are a couple of my current ones. And all-time favorite, believe it or not, I like, I go way back. I really like Jack Benny. There's a guy named Victor Borga, who I barely talk about in my book, who I just adored. I thought he was so funny and wonderful, and so I liked him, and there's so many, Shanley and Seinfeld, and believe it or not, Woody Allen had a very short stand-up career and I know he's a little bit of
his
a
albums
controversial
are
subject. Yeah, I just thought he was.
There's a 2-disc thing. I call it 2-disc because if people have disc now, but there's a 2-disc thing called the Woody Allen the nightclub years, I think it is, which is amazing long form comedy. These terrific stories from his peak. Personal issues aside, he was a very funny guy. So, by
the way, I wrote a joke about. I wrote a famous joke about Woody Allen that I did on the Tonight Show. I'll do it for you now for free. Here we go. It's great to be here in New York because this is where Woody Allen's from. Say what you will, it's now been 18 years and he's still married to the same daughter. So that's incredible. That's guys.
I refer everybody to my statement at the beginning of all this about the content of tonight's program. No, that's fantastic. All right, I'm scrolling down through here. Henny Young, someone named iPhone asks, Henny Youngman telling his own jokes and roasts, what was that all about? So I guess as opposed to roasting people, he was sticking to his famous one.
Oh, yeah. Well, Henny wasn't known for being a great ad-libber, more as a guy who just memorized a bunch of jokes, and that's all he could really. There was another comedian like that, Rodney Dangerfield, same kind of thing, where it was, he was just one line after another line. But I love Henny Youngman for the purity of that act, and that he stuck to his guns no matter what. He would just do that act. It was incredible. And yeah, can we talk about just a little bit about how comedy is generational? Remember your first question about why comedians aren't remembered is that stand-up is very generational. It's almost like milk. It goes bad pretty fast because times change, language changes, references change. So, like, for example, there's a great joke that Henny Youngman, like a mother-in-law joke, and we go, I just got back from a pleasure trip. I took my mother-in-law to the airport. So that was the joke. So you can't do that joke today, not because, all right, you don't want to do a mother-in-law or terrible, whatever that joke is. But no one knows what a pleasure trip is. No one knows that language. So it would sound like, I don't even know what this guy's talking about. I mean, there's business trips. So just the jargon of the language changes from decade to decade, from year to year. So that's why comedy tends to get time-stamped and then like, oh, this is not funny to me anymore.
Do all comedians want to be rock stars?
I don't know. I can't speak for all.
Because you straddle the music and
Oh yeah, I
comedy
play music. Yeah, that's just because of Victor Borga and Chico Marx, and there was a guy named Roger Ray. I can't believe anyone would know him. I saw him do his act, and I just love comedians that used music in there. And Steve Martin used the banjo in his act, so I just love it.
Wayne's album,
By the way, some comedians think that's cheating, so I have to live with that, guys.
On your album, you would Wayne's album is unique in that it starts with it's recordings, not maybe the highest fidelity recordings very early in his career to later on, but you get to hear him jam on the electric ukulele, which is not something I think anybody else has done in their act, and it's pretty entertaining. So let's get back to the list here. What do we have? Slapstick. What is your opinion? My least favorite, says Beverly Rosen, who is not a fan of the movie Airplane, I'm guessing.
Not a fan of Airplane.
I'm guessing basically she doesn't like slapstick, and there's no shortage of that in Airplane.
Well, I try to. Slapstick really isn't part of stand-up for the most part, because slapstick usually is involving two people with one person slapping the other one with a stick. By the way, just so you know, the origin of that term slapstick, it was originally a noun. It was a specific kind of wooden stick that had a spring on it and another piece of wood attached. Excuse me. So when you hit somebody, it would make a very loud cracking sound. And that was a slapstick that comedians would use in burlesque shows, which is something we didn't even get into. But there was always somebody hitting. It was you wouldn't hit yourself with a slapstick. And that became known as slapstick comedy. More in film, right? More like what they were doing with the Keystone Cops and things like that.
Here's Bev Friedman. Here's an interesting one. And again, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to get to everybody's questions. We're doing what we can.
Sorry,
and
guys.
Thank you for sending them all in, and keep sending them. Someone says hi from another JCC, Schwartz Reisman in Toronto, Canada. Love Toronto. Hello,
Yes.
Hello, Toronto. How have Canadians influenced stand-up? But there's no shortage of famous Canadian comedians at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great. They tend to be. I mean, Norm Macdonald just passed away, and he was one of my all-time favorites. And Jim Carrey comes down. He was playing a club called Yuck Yucks. Comes down to L.A. during the early Carson comedy boom to get on the Tonight Show, and then has one of the most remarkable years in the history of any stand-up. No one has come close. Had 3 feature films open the same year. Mask, Dumb and Dumber, and what's the one with the... the Mask, Dumb and Dumber, and Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. Right? Ace Ventura, yeah. All in the same year. By the end of the year, he's the highest paid actor in Hollywood, $20 million a movie. Like, that never happened to anyone, not to Belushi, not to Red Skelton, Woody Allen, no one. So incredible. And Canada is, I think, also, they're just a great observer. They're like, I've been up there so many times, and they're like, I don't know, they're like the cousin, and we're like the crazy, rich people with the Corvettes, and they're like, well, what's going on over there? So they're the best. They're the best. So good. Great question, Toronto.
And here somebody mentions a name, Barry Shapiro. Hi, yeah, Barry again. He put the name here. I don't know this name. Jack Douglas. Who's Jack Douglas?
Jack Douglas.
Jack Douglas.
I need some more. For some reason, that name sounds familiar, but I don't know.
We need context, Barry. So throw some context in there. Here we go. Thoughts on Jackie Mason, who...
I just wrote an article for Vulture magazine about the late Jacob Makov, I think his name was. Incredible story. And remember, we were talking earlier that ethnic comedians were on their way out, and that everyone was doing the Frank Fay, Bob Hope, Jack Benny kind of act for years. Alan King is part of that, Jan Murray, all of those guys were from the same mold. And then Jackie Mason comes along and is like, guess what? This is what I speak with this thick Yiddish accent, this like Brooklynese. And his agents were like, you can't go on television like that. And Jackie Mason was really interesting because he's a very strident guy. And he was like, you're just embarrassed of your Jewish roots. I know what's going on here. And guess what? I'm not going to take elocution lessons. I'm going to speak like this. And he caught a huge wave when the country was like very much into Jewish comedy. There was a guy called my son, the folk singer, Alan Sherman, had these hit records, and Havana Gila was a hit. It was like people were into Judaism in the early 60s. It was like a big thing. A 2,000-Year-Old Man. I don't know if you remember that album. That was like a real wave going on. And he caught that and then had this incredible comeback in the 80s. No one thought it was even possible. Jackie Mason would be this huge star on Broadway. And just an amazing story. I won't even get into the Ed Sullivan thing with the finger, but and then it became a little more very conservative. There was a guy named Rabbi Kahani, I think that guy's name is. Anyway, but amazing stand-up career. And my uncle had his album very early on. Let me leave you with the words of a great comedian.
And a great cameo, a great appearance in Mel Brooks' History of the World during the scene. Yes. Okay, so let's end with this because we're just about out of time. We got to let Wayne go. But somebody asked something that would lined up with one of my questions anyway. They say, "What about the late night talk show hosts?" So talk for a second then about the kingmakers, the influence of the late night hosts on all of
sure.
Well, half of that century.
Let me just I'll frame it this way. At every moment in the history of stand-up, since the 1900s, let's say since the early 1900s, there's been a booking the comedians craved that would sort of make their career, that would sort of endorse them as like, oh, this guy's a headliner, this guy's a great comedian. In the early part of the century, starting in 1913, was playing the Palace in vaudeville. If you played the Palace, you could tour the whole country. Then the Palace is gone, and then you could maybe play the Copacabana, and that was the big club in New York that everyone wanted to play direct from the Copacabana. And maybe even in Florida, there was the Fontainebleau in the 50s. That was a very big booking you could get. Then television comes along and it was the Ed Sullivan Show. And the Ed Sullivan Show ran from 1948 to 1971. Long time. And then when that sort of started to fade, late night comedy sort of took over. Late night, talk shows and Saturday Night Live sort of began to take over. So it starts with Jack Parr, and then Johnny Carson becomes this kingmaker. So if you got on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, I don't know if you saw Louis Anderson just died, but his first Tonight Show is amazing from 1984. And then the next day, Louis Anderson had a $250,000 development deal with NBC. Carol, she notices my picture of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis from the Stooge. And then after the Tonight Show was getting on maybe an HBO special. I don't know if you remember those years. And now it's Netflix. It's having a Netflix special. So there's always been this booking. So it hasn't, in a sense, the technology has changed remarkably, but the idea of like, oh, there's a king of the hill, there's a top banana, it still exists, just like it did when Bob Hope was performing in One.
And so we'll end it the way you end your book, which with that exact same term, in One. And I could go on and on like this forever, but out of respect to everyone.
By the way, I have a website if you want to email me, or if you have a question or anything, or if I got something wrong, or that Jack Douglas, for some reason I know it's something to do with television, and I think it has to do with late night, but I'm not sure. I've never been stumped before. A classic Boca Raton JCC stumping me. I appreciate it. Classic.
But Wayne, this has been thoroughly enjoyable for me, and I hope for all of our viewers. I strongly encourage everyone to check it out. You can see how dog-eared
it's not that long,
my
right?
personal copy is here. No, it's a very quick read, but I don't know if that's a real selling point for a book. You know, if it's a good book, you don't want it to end.
It's
And I know you
$11,
disagree
guys.
with
$11.
my 2 week deep research approach, but the deep, for me, the fun of it is then going to YouTube and checking out all these people. The late night, you know, you talked about the late night thing. There's a great story in the book and also on the podcast about Freddie Prinz's first appearance on the show and the impact that had on his life. There's so much in here. So if you love comedy, check out the book. Wayne Federman. What is your website again, Wayne?
It's just WayneFetterman.com. This is really not creative at all.
But easy to find. Easy to find.
Very easy.
Easy to
But
find.
there's a thing you can link and you can send me an email or something like that. So if you want, I know a lot of people have done this after these chats because I'll, you know, so
But aren't
anyway,
happy,
thank
Wayne,
you
that-
so
that-
much. I wish I was down. I'm going to be in Plantation this weekend. I will be there Friday and Saturday for South Plantation's 50th anniversary of the school. They were built same year as Piper and all of those other schools.
So if we
So,
see somebody that looks like you, it is you, is what you're saying. If it's
Yeah. I'll be in Florida.
be in
So I can't believe I didn't get to see you. I really wanted to come down there. Maybe another time.
we hope.
Anytime you're in town, just let us know, and we're happy to give you a tour and hook you up with another talk. But it's been a real pleasure, Wayne. Thank you very much.
And when
Okay,
you write
later.
the History of Stand-Up Part 2, that is when, you know, you can come down and do that with us. We appreciate that. But I did want to just say thank you so much, Jared, for really the deep dive into the book. We do appreciate that you really did. And I'm sure Wayne did too, that you had so many great questions for him. And I think everybody on this Zoom today smiled a lot throughout this whole program, as you know, you brought up so many moments for so many people and so many comedians and just names that maybe we haven't thought about for a long time. So I thought that was just really terrific. So thank you for doing that, for making us smile tonight, to make us laugh. And everybody who joined us, we appreciate you taking the time. We invite you back for our next Florida JCC program, which is going to be with Yori Adani. And that's actually called something about startup. Wait, let me think what it's called. I'm going to look it up because I thought it was kind of, the Unstoppable Startup, which is different than the History of Stand-Up, but it's about Israel. But I thought it was kind of funny that it has a similar up in there. Anyway, maybe that'll make you go on to your JCCs, your home JCCs that are part of this, and look at all the wonderful programs that they are offering right now, both virtual and some are coming back in person. And we hope to see you again. Thank you so much, everybody.